Welcome to the Archetypal Mosaic. This is Mikhail Tank. Today's special guest is Sindri Eldon, musician. Welcome.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Good. Is this a recording?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Just finish.
So Sindri, welcome to the Archetypal Mosaic. What does music mean for you? I mean, after all, you come from a musical family, and you're a musician yourself. Is it in your blood, in your bones?
Yeah, I've actually been doing a lot of thinking about this lately. Music, as much as I believe that something can be in your blood, because I'm more of a nurture guy than a nature guy. I think we adapt to our surroundings as children. And, subconsciously, without really realizing it, because I never really was interested in music as a kid. I never had any desire to be a musician or understand it at all. But subconsciously, I think just being surrounded by it and, that was the normal, and it there was never really a point where I sort of decided to become a musician. It just sort of happened because that's what was going on around me. And I mean, it wasn't just my family and my parents. It was just like everyone, like kids around me and my friends, we're all sort of starting bands, and I just sort of went with the flow. I'm sorry, the first part of your question was about the...
No, you're doing great. I mean, we're talking about just how does music come to you, how does it relate to you, and, it's part of who you are. I read on your website that you say that being in airports and hotels is where you feel most at home.
Yeah, I mean, I feel at home in a lot of places. I traveled a lot as a kid, but I mean, my parents were on tour, and, my earliest memories are, buses and planes and places like that. And I've noticed as I get older that I'm always a little bit more at ease when I'm traveling than most of my friends. I think I've sort of... I mean, that said, air travel really has become despicably awful, especially domestic air travel in the U.S. is. I mean, I was led to understand that it was bad here, but my word.
Do you mean bad in terms of going too congested?
It's the airlines will dick you, and and they. Ever since they stopped smoking on airplanes, they don't have to recycle the air as often anymore. So you're breathing recycled air. And
were you born when were you alive when they were smoking on airplanes? Because I wasn't alive back then. This was a long time ago.
I don't really remember. Now that you mention it, I don't remember ever seeing anybody smoking on a plane.
Yeah, that's not a good idea.
I remember they had the sign still when I was a kid. The sign would come on to tell you not to smoke, but it was illegal anyway. I mean, at least on Icelandic planes, it was illegal.
I'll tell you, I'm really glad there's no smoking on airplanes. I would not want to see anybody smoking on an airplane. But I remember my first airplane was actually being on an Aeroflot flight out of Russia. So that was really interesting.
Is that where you're from?
Yeah, I'm from St. Petersburg.
Ooh.
So we're both kind of natives in a strange land in a way.
Yeah.
So your mom is a very famous singer and songwriter, Björk, Goodman's daughter. How do you pronounce it correctly?
Yeah, something like that.
And then your father, you said he was on tour too. What was he doing on tour?
He was the guitarist in my mom's band at the time, the Sugar Cubes.
Very cool.
And he now he's done some film music, and he recorded he recorded some of my album, and he does mixing and production for all kinds of people. He was doing he was mixing a Danish. There was some singer songwriter. Yeah, I mean he sort of dabbled in it more than my mom sort of pursued it as a career. And I guess I'm somewhere between the two of them.
And then tell me, when you record, do you? I don't know if you know this, but I've released quite a lot of albums. I have a major distributor.
Oh yeah, I had no idea.
And so I record it sometimes in studios and stuff. But where do you like to record it? Do you use Pro Tools or what's your?
Well, I've recorded in a variety of places, and usually not, very nice places, just sort of rehearsal spaces and living rooms and stuff. I did make a very sort of hi-fi album that was made in a real studio, the most of it anyway, and I have some experience with that. The most recent album I did, I recorded almost all of it by myself in my kitchen using some pretty primitive methods, and I liked the sort of DIY aspect of it. And I mean, I've done a lot of that, like a lot since I was like 14, just make DIY recording, and I feel like I've sort of hit the limits of what I can do with that, but mostly it was just a difficult experience making this last record, doing the at-home recordings. Very difficult because when you're doing it everything by yourself, you become your own boss kind of, and you're always very hard on yourself, and there's no one to blame if anything sounds wrong because it's all you. And I had some panic attacks and stuff, and just it was a really rough experience, and I'm not eager to repeat it. I think I'd like someone with me next time around.
Well, maybe you and I should collaborate. I have a fantastic sound engineer, actually, who does a lot of great stuff. I'll tell you about it after we do the recording. So let's talk about you. What influences you? You're wearing a Fleetwood Mac hoodie. What kind of music? Does it just happen to be there? What kind of music has influenced you?
I sort of have. I'm very much a product of my time and place in some ways. Like sort of late '90s rock, kind of pop rock stuff. Is very much a part of who I am. Like Jimmy Eat World and stuff like that. Was what was on the radio when I was a teenager. But lately, I'm starting with Fleetwood Mac and then using them as sort of a gateway drug into the larger world of it. I've been really delving into soft rock and sort of 70s and 80s. Radio, American kind of radio rock and pop. Steely Dan and Doobie Brothers, and I guess more proggy stuff as well. Yes, and Rush, and I don't know, all kinds of stuff. I've been just sort of. It's nice because I collect records, and in Iceland, the cheapest records you can get, like the cheap bins, are sort of more kind of Eurotrash, sort of local stuff, and a lot of like punk and sort of 80s pop, and not really the stuff that I'm interested in. But here, when I moved here, I found that the cheapest records here are radio, AOR stuff and soft rock and sort of 70s. Kind of older stuff, and it's just a relatively new and still very fascinating world to me, and not one that I was ever exposed to. I mean, my parents were, very, very punk and very anti all that, very, very against all of that kind of American. That's sort of the generation before them in Iceland, and they sort of, to them that was the enemy, and. So I've had to sort of discover it all myself, but it's been fun. It's been great. I'm just digging deeper and deeper, and Yeah.
Let's talk about your internal artistic vision. So basically, not only how would you necessarily describe your music, because it's really hard to do sometimes, but also if you were to put it into an image, and describe an image, it could be anything, from chickens walking on pizza or whatever it is, just an image that can be conveyed.
Wow, that's an interesting question. I guess the first thing that sort of pops into my head is sort of a feeling of kind of, you're on a shore and the tide's coming in, or you're in a room and it's filling with water, or and you're not sure if anyone can hear you. It's it's dark. Maybe you have like a lighter or something to. I always it always feels very private to me, very very personal, and very. It's funny because you're put in these sort of social situations where you're making music with people and it's shared and you have to communicate in order to get it right. And of course the best sharing and communicating happens when there's no words are necessary, but only a few musicians are lucky enough to find people like that. And in the meantime, it's always felt very much like I'm it seems by definition kind of a lonely pursuit, because you can't really, you have to share everything with everyone, but at the same time you can't really talk to anyone about it. I don't know. I guess like as you say, probably everyone has a different image in mind, and I've never been asked anything like this before.
You brought up some interesting things on your website. For example, we'll talk about Christmas season, and we'll talk about the atmosphere that's so important, including this atmosphere of projet and the atmosphere of ice and non-ice. And then also I want to talk to you about the recordings that you do and the importance of physical releases that you and I seem to agree on. See, I think physical, when you CDs, vinyls, not only do they have collector's value, do they have archetypal value, do they have the resale value? I mean, they have so much value, plus you can hold it in your hand and imagine stuff.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I'm a record collector. I think that they can be beautiful works of art in more ways than just what you hear.
You can have it signed by the artist. The digital one you can't really obviously have signed. There's so many things. So in terms of the physical aspect, do you prefer to release things physically?
I think they're just they're separate things. I think there's an immediacy to digital that I find very tough for an independent musician or and especially one in this economy. It's very tough, I think, for you to get a physical release out while it's still fresh and while it still means a damn to you and while it's still current and what you're currently into music, whereas digital sort of allows you to the music can go directly to people. Like the album I just put out, I was doing finishing touches to the mixes like less than a week before it came out, and just making sure that everything was a reflection of what I wanted to do right then and there. And you can't really do that with a physical release. But, all that said, I think in almost every way I would prefer, to do physical. I mean, I do physical releases for every one of my thing. They're just not, pressed in a factory. I make them myself, just CDs, and in almost every way, the physical release is more authoritative, and it is more of a complete vision. I wouldn't say it's better, but it's it has things that the digital release, may not have. But I think it's also important to note that I think it's mostly just really serious music fans who are listening to albums anymore. We've sort of come full circle in that way, that the single now sort of dominates again, but it's a digital single. It's not like 7 inches or stuff like that. It's playlists and I don't want to sound like Grandpa Fuddy Daddy here. I don't dislike it. It's just different.
The way it is. I really miss maxi singles, like 5-7 track EPs of one song with an image. I love that stuff.
They have like the 80s dance remixes of them.
90s too. Yeah, I love that. Now about your album, you say you just released an album. Tell the audience what's it called, where people can get it, and what it's about.
Oh, sure. It's called Okay to Disconnect, and it came out Christmas Day 2017, last year. It was an attempt to make kind of a new kind of album for me. I did pretty much all of it by myself, sort of slowly over the course of the year. And my lyrics are always just a reflection of what's going on in my head at the time. I try to be as honest as I can. I don't, I'm not really much of a storyteller when it comes to lyrics. And, what has been going through my head is, I've just moved here to Seattle, and, I don't really have a day job, or I'm not going to school or anything. And so, my wife has a job and is going to school. So I've ended up spending a lot of time alone here at home, and the isolation brings out interesting things. And just I think also just the age I'm at. I'm 31. There seems to come a lot of realization. You sort of put the habits of your 20s in context, and assess what it is you want to keep and what you don't, and memories. A lot of the lyrics on the album are to do with sort of memories and maybe nostalgia and sort of reaching out into the past maybe, and hoping against hope that that the people you feel that you've wronged think well of you or have forgiven you, and also
sounds very conscious. There's a consciousness and a consciousness, with conscience. So as opposed to it being kind of disconnected from the self, it's actually quite connected with your internal solitude, right? You're kind of really connected to your own conscious self.
I mean, the disconnect of the album title is more about sort of choosing what affects you and choosing what you decide to let into your your emotional consciousness, if you will, and maybe I think a lot of people feel obligated to, or I do anyway, I feel obligated to be knowledgeable and participate and compete, really, is the word. and I'm not a very competitive person.
Mm-hmm.
And in giving myself license to disconnect, I thought it was important for the title track to come across as a message to people that it's okay to disconnect. It's okay to just, you know, not. It's okay to focus on what you want to focus on, and it's kind of a nihilistic message in a way, but I think people kind of need to hear that a little bit. I mean, a lot of the lyrics are about sort of self-loathing and self-doubt, and it's something that's always accompanied me. But again, you know, now that I'm sort of the age where I can start to assess the qualities in myself, you know, I'm finding that maybe I have an unhealthy excess of self criticism that, you know, that needs to be shed somehow.
Art is a great way to clear that stuff. Is your stuff available? Where can people buy the album?
Yeah, sorry. My album, I work with a little local label here in Seattle called Knick-Knack Records, and they have a website, knickknackrecords.com, and also my website, sindrieldon.com, which I admit I do not visit on a regular basis. Should have links to Knick-Knack Records, where all of my recordings can be obtained.
Okay, that's great. Now let's talk about the atmosphere that resonates with you, that allows you to shed the skin of the past and to move forward creatively. So, do you originate from Iceland?
Yeah. I grew up there and was mostly raised there. You know, as I said before, I kind of grew up on the road a lot.
Right.
But Iceland was, you know, I mean, it's where I'm from, and it is my home country, sort of, for better or for worse.
And then this, how do you, I want to pronounce this correctly, Puget?
The Puget Sound?
Yeah. So what is that? And you're connected to that now, right?
The Puget Sound is just it's a body of water. Mm-hmm. It's a saline body of water that's between Seattle and the Olympic Peninsula. But I think I sort of like to use, and I'm sure I'm not the first person who's done this. I'm sure there's a compilation or a radio show or something out there, but you know, I think I've used it a few times in a sort of the pun sense of the word, that there is a Puget sound, like a sort of Seattle sound. Most people, when they hear Seattle, you know, musically, they'll think of grunge, but I think that there are bands that I far more associate with Seattle and what Seattle is actually like than grunge. You know, there's both a very sort of, you know, there was in its time a very sort of psychedelic and inclusive nature to it, and sort of pushing things forward, you know, like Jimi Hendrix and the Sonics. But yeah, more recently, I feel like, you know, the sound of Seattle has become something else. I mean, you know, neither of them are technically from Seattle, but you know, like bands like Modest Mouse and Built to Spill, that sort of I identify more with just being here, just living here and walking around here and driving around here. Those are the more fitting soundtracks to what the Pacific Northwest is to me than grunge ever was. I'm not a huge grunge fan, actually, so I'm not the most neutral judge of that.
So let me ask you this transition. So from Iceland, if you could artistically tell me, how do you feel like, how does it inspire you artistically, the Icelandic landscapes, and then, now all these beautiful trees and water and stuff, and then everything in between, all the traveling you've done? What has it done for you artistically speaking?
Well, I think there's definitely an Icelandic sort of sonic landscape, a very sort of open, reverby kind of wash, like a very Silros kind of, just sort of. And I could, you can see that driving around in Iceland, because you got no trees there, and it's all very sort of open and, barren, but in this sort of weirdly pregnant way. It's not barren in the way that it doesn't feel desolate. It feels sort of full of promise and mystery. A little bit like it's more like a blank slate, I guess. Whereas, like here is more of a, everything's very wet here. Everything's very sort of, there's a lot of oxygen in the air, especially after it rains. And I think there's people are more, I'm sorry, what was the question again?
Sure, you're actually going really well. We're talking about the artistic landscapes. You're going right in. You're actually right in it.
And I think that a combination of the two is what I hope that people might find in the new album. That I took some Iceland with me, and it's funny how it comes out more when you're not there. Like when I was there, you sort of strive to sound different from everybody, and but when I'm out here, I'm sort of a bit more willing to indulge in the Icelandic side of me. But I'm also really glad that I left it behind. I think anyone who's left a small town where they grew up can relate to the sense of freedom of just having shed the weight of those expectations, and not just because of who my mom is, but I think because you're in a small town, people know you and they know what to expect from you, and there's anonymity is a weirdly precious thing, and I don't think a lot of people realize that. I guess if you grew up in a huge city, you're sick of being just another face, but like being able to just blend into a crowd is like a pleasure I didn't really discover until I moved here.
That's great. You're saying about anonymity in your place, but is your mom basically like the most famous person in Iceland?
Well, it's always different for locals, isn't it? It's like, who's famous there isn't who's famous elsewhere. She's, I think people recognize her, but she's just sort of been there, and people, she was never, the music that's popular there locally, and politicians there probably get recognized as much, if not more, especially the younger generation. If you're a teenager now, then you weren't even alive when my mom was still doing gigs a lot in Iceland, and so it's I don't know.
Mm-hmm. So,
but if I had to guess offhand, I'd say no. She's probably not the most recognizable person in Iceland to Icelanders. Mm-hmm. But I think as a face to foreigners, it's hard to think of anyone. I guess in England they had like the guy who did that show Mastermind. He was from Iceland, but I don't think he was raised there. I think he was probably the most recognizable face of Iceland before my mom came along. Maybe he still is to them. I don't know. Maybe he's dead. He's pretty old.
So, what are some of your artistic and musical plans?
Well, I just put out this record, and now the challenge is upon me to promote it as best I can when I have no live band or means of performing any of the music. Except my band still lives in Iceland, and I want to join a band or build a band here, but that's going to take some time. And in the meantime, I'm very content to experiment with other ways of furthering my musical career. Stuff that you don't have time for when you're busy, going to rehearsals and playing shows a lot. You can sort of tend to your garden. I have all these recordings, and they're now available for the first time in one place. And this new stuff just came out, and I want to try to see if I can push it at all. Maybe try to get it on the radio, or see how far I can go without an actual band. I didn't. Most of the music that I listen to, and most of the music that I've listened to my whole life, the highlight was always listening to the album at home. Going to a show is fun, and you get to feel like you're part of something, and there's that sort of human togetherness. But musically, I think it sort of goes without saying that you're never going to sound as good on stage as you do in a good studio. I think, to me, I see no inherent problem with being a non-live act, because I haven't, like most of the bands I listen to, I've never seen them live, and I probably never will, and that's fine with me. I've become a fan all the same.
That's a really good point. I've been to lots of different shows, and there are a few singers who are actually better live than they're in studio. In studio, they feel kind of like pressed, and in live they feel free. There's a R&B singer, Shantae Moore. She can do like 5 octaves, just like Mariah Carey and Nima Sumac, and she's better live in person for me. And because there's freedom, there's complete freedom. Yeah. There's no constraints. There's no microphone. Somebody telling you what to do. So, but I know what you mean. It's very true, and you and I share that, because I also prefer studio work. When I perform, it's more about performance, not about vocals for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's talk about a couple of more questions as we kind of come to a conclusion of the interview. Talismans and amazing memories that help your art. So both of these are, if they're too personal, don't you don't have to share anything, but whatever you feel like sharing. Say it again.
Nothing. Keep going.
So one of them is about your, let's see, any kind of memory that really inspires your creativity, and also any talisman that you hold dear that also can archetypally inspire your creativity.
Well, the memory thing is, it's kind of intellectual rather than emotional. But I always remember just times that people have said stuff about my music, and I think of I think of those specific people, and for some reason there are just people that you try a little harder to impress, and I guess a lot of times when I need lyrics for a song, or and maybe my life is fine, or there's nothing that immediately springs to mind, I do call up memories of feelings and emotions, and I've been accused of sort of critics have sort of expressed irritation at my seeming unwillingness to move beyond kind of teenage themes in my lyrics. but those are the emotions that resonate the strongest with people, and they still feel them. And
Absolutely.
you know, and it's not just nostalgically. You know, I think that when something resonates with you emotionally, you know, it does sort of harken back to that. But I mean, I feel like I'm progressing a little bit away from that, but still, you know, I think of that as a starting point. As far as talismans are concerned, you mean like a physical object?
Yes.
Yeah. Boy. No, I mean, you know, when an instrument becomes your sort of main go-to instrument, then, you know, there's a feeling associated with it, I guess. But I've never had like any kind of object that inspires me or that I sort of seek strength from when I'm writing.
That's cool.
But maybe I should though. Maybe that would give me some focus and direction. I've just moved around so much in my life, and I can't get it. I learned pretty early that if I get attached to objects, I'll just lose them and feel bad. So I don't really form attachments to physical objects that way.
That's very cool.
I'm just absent-minded as well. I lose everything. Like, even if I hadn't moved around, I think I'd still just have lost everything.
Well, that's very cool because you're always doing something new then. You know, what I want to say is related to what you said before about this criticism you're getting. And, you know, as males in society, we're so pressured to become men really early on. It's like as soon as you're 20, you're supposed to be a man. It's like you know, I take my time. And the last transformation is indeed the time that we become males, you know, reproductive males, which is teenage years. But when you become a man, I think it really honestly happens around 40. I mean, it depends on everybody's different, but so between that thing, you're still in a different stage. You're still a young soul, and I mean, soul can always be young, but I mean, and I think that the fact that in this society people pressure, you know, you got to become a man, and it's like, I'm not ready to become a man. Like, I'm only transforming into a man, you know, and I don't like to be rushed. So
you're sort of forced to transpose these teenage feelings onto, you know, shit that you have to deal with as you get older, you know, and you maybe don't have any other way to react to them, really.
And I think it's great for you to just take your time. I mean, I know I took my time. I'm still taking my time. And I think that that's really the key. Just not to ever, you know, respond to anybody's criticism as why shouldn't I? I mean, this is what I'm doing.
Yeah. I mean, I you know, you can't get wrapped up in this stuff because people just, you know, there's so much to understand, and the older I get, the more I feel like it's such a leap to think that you can understand someone just by listening to their music. And I mean, as I get older, I also, you know, I feel like, you know, there's greater emotional depths to be reached in sort of soul searching and introspection than any emotional turmoil, like external. But I mean, I feel like I've sung about that a lot as well, that I seem to myself, I feel like I'm largely unaffected by sort of external events, and it's always my own mind and thoughts that seem to bring me grief. But yeah, I definitely feel like that it's not necessarily wrong to stay young like that. And in fact, I feel like it's, you know, we're encouraged everywhere we look to keep a young mind, you know. The yogis talk about, you know, the beginner's mind and you know, and those days when when stuff like love and sex and jealousy and desire and guilt are fresh to you, and they, and they're the most confusing. You might feel them the most, but articulating those thoughts is for a more experienced artist, and I think looking back on that stuff later can produce great work.
Yeah. Well, that's fantastic. I mean, I think we've had a really great conversation. Is there anything else that you'd like to share about your art, music, thoughts, anything else before we complete?
Well, I mean, in relation to what we've been talking about, I just feel like I can never think of anything to say when people ask me that. I should have something ready next time. But yeah, I mean, I guess all of what I am, like every single part of me, everything there is to know about me, is in my music. I've always been very open like that, and I mean, that's the whole point, like one day I'll be dead and the music will still be there in some way, barring, nuclear war. But, and so if you want the music to afford you that measure of immortality, which is sort of why we all do it a little bit, I think, then you should always be as honest as you possibly can be, because one day you'll be dead and you won't be able to explain or help people understand you. All they'll have is the music then.
Bravo to that. It's funny you just said that, because the latest single I released is called "I Will Haunt You Nicely," and it's a message from the other side, as if. So I couldn't agree with you more. That was beautifully said, Sindri.
Thank you.
I'm really glad that you're a guest on the show, and I wish you great creative success and whatever kind of peace and the comfort and whatever else you wish for yourself.
Yeah, thank you, and likewise. What a great talk.